Hi everyone, my name is Zoheb Mashiur, and I'll be speaking to you today about my PhD thesis topic, which is uh, the British literature's depictions of Indian soldiers during World War One. Now, before I get into discussing the literature itself, I want to give a brief overview of the on the subject of colonial soldiers in World War One, migration, mobility in general. So, during World War One, during the years of 1914 and 1918. Um, the British and French empires demobilized the various colonies and dominions, recruit massive amounts of recruitment of laborers and soldiers, and they were deployed all over the world across the various theaters in which the British and French empires were fighting. So not just they weren't just confined to the quote unquote colonial periphery. They weren't just in their own backyard, but posted anywhere from all the way from the Western Front to Samoa, all over the world. And in on the Western Front itself to Europe, the British and French they recruited and deployed about 650,000 non-white colonial soldiers in general, who were supplemented by a further 400,000 civilian workers from the various colonies and even allied nations such as China. So about a million non-white people arrived in Europe during the war years, which is kind of like a reversal of the typical trajectory of mobility that we associate with imperialism, because these people from the quote unquote periphery were arriving in the so-called heartland of the heartland of empire, the metropolis of empire in Europe itself. And this has been conceived of as by Christian Kohler, for example, as a sort of example of a massive transcontinental military migration, which the scholar Santanu Das referred to as a turning point in the history of cultural encounter and entanglements. And it's really this cultural encounter that's when you're looking at, because these encounters they were invariably in the context of the existing racialized hierarchies of empire of the perceiving that persisted during the time, and number of anxieties erupted amongst the European population in response to these non-white labor, which are quite pressingly familiar to anyone who follows the so quote-unquote refugee crisis in Europe and the controversies over migrants in the US, for example. Uh, all sorts of notions such as the themes of anxieties were quite familiar. The personal security of white populations in proximity to these non-white laborers and soldiers, worries about interracial sex and people taking and these laborers taking jobs, especially which was an especially big problem in France. There were there's a lot of pressure created by the soldiers socially, and by the soldiers and laborers from abroad. And for the British public and state, for example, the presence of these kind of racialized others in the home front kind of served as a manifestation of like the alterity of the war itself, right? So the Indian Army, especially, was quite fraught with a number of its own peculiar problems, because unlike unlike France, who kind of deployed people from across its colonial sphere in combat in Europe, Britain didn't really do that. Britain, even if it was deploying soldiers from the Caribbean or soldiers from New Zealand and so on, Maori soldiers, even if they were as soon as they arrived in Europe, they were deployed in like non-combat positions. However, Indians were unique in being the only non-white colonial forces deployed by the British in Europe were deployed in combat. And there were many of them. There were 140,000 Indian soldiers and laborers deployed to Europe alone between 1914 and 1918, and they really brought about the tensions of empire, really. So the problem was that at the time, India was going through a sort of climate of revolutionary dissent, of like demanding a greater recognition of autonomy as like more partners, not just racialized subalterns of the imperial project, which was kind of exacerbated by problems at home of British discomforts with the sort of cognitive dissonance of having an increasingly liberal domestic space and a despotic imperial zone beyond that. So to kind of navigate these revolutionary and also internal problems of the British Empire, the Indian Army was kind of presented to both the British and Indian public as loyalists serving the crown. And kind of media campaign began to highlight what Claerbuck called the oxymoron of involuntary subjugation. And the discourse of the Indian soldier really had to grapple with fundamentally the implications of armed non-white men learning to fight white men in Europe. And German propaganda really seized on this as kind of like a sort of betrayal of core tenets of white supremacist imperialism, because the Germans didn't deploy any soldiers or laborers from any of the colonial spheres to Europe. And the Indian Army had an especially unique history of problematization, because in 1857 it had rebelled against the East India Company. So subsequent to it, to 1857, all British imperial military policy was all about not just using the army to quell further rebellion, but also managing the army itself as a source of potential rebellion in its own right. And they kind of developed these tropes of martial races, to paint Indian soldiers as primitive, gallant warriors who were a threat to the enemy, but also docile and loyal to their masters. And these tropes really kind of colored the representations that were being produced of Indian soldiers in Europe during the First World War, where there's a lot of attention being put towards, how colorful they were, how they were from an ancient civilization, their use of cavalry, their use of pre-modern weaponry, lances and swords and all that. And partially to kind of have like a vicariously live out a sort of European fantasy of like a masculine chivalrous combat in like World War One, where distance firing, trench warfare, very static artillery and all that. That kind of like fantasy of a kind of like much more adventurous sort of warfare was completely gone. But the Indians kind of represented a kind of potentiality to return to that. At the same time, this sort of like focus on Indians as hand-to-hand combatants also fed into like their construction of them as like primitives, and at the same, and a lot of discourse that surrounded them kind of focused on them as animalistic, as bestial, as dripping tigers, or having cat-like agility. And there was a lot of focus on like depictions of Indian soldiers with like knives between their teeth, or like hacking off people's heads and so on with like one stroke and all that. And so at the same time, so the presence of these colonial soldiers also kind of represented Europe's anxieties surrounding itself at the time, as like kind of descending into a sort of primitive barbarism during the war itself. So colonial soldier was kind of like a self-projection of that. And this kind of like the discursive tension between like the idea of colonial loyalty and primitive savagery was especially evident in like the hospitalization of Indian soldiers, where there was a great care given to making sure Indian soldiers had the right care, the right caste treatment, religious regulations like halal slaughter and all that. Like everything was really, really well done, crystal clear, and this was like a very much a big part of propaganda, like how well Indian soldiers were being taken care of in British hospitals. But at the same time, these hospitals were sites that were essentially like prisons, because Indian soldiers couldn't leave without white chaperones, mostly because of fears of them encountering and having any sort of relations with like white women, especially the nurses, who were mostly upper class women. And the hospitals themselves were often the sites within which Indian soldiers would be writing letters back home. So from the front and from the hospitals in the UK, Indian soldiers would weekly write about 10 to 20,000 letters, despite being illiterate. And these, because of their illiteracy, there was often the presence of scribes who kind of transcribed their thoughts for them. And these scribes were like a first layer of like mediation between like actual Sepoy discourse. And the other layer of mediation was much more state mandated, where it's like there was a censor board specifically determined to prevent to censor material that referred to things like malingering, which is the act of wounding oneself to make sure that you get out of the war, and any form of imperial discontent, any reference to sex with white women or romance and so on, like all of that was being censored out. And the censor board would collate all this material, would like create like a cross section continuously of like a material that's being censored, material that isn't being censored, to just create like a sense of like a snapshot, if you will, of like how the Indian Army's morale is at any point and what they're talking about. So despite being this double layer of mediation between the scribes and the censor board, this body of like a censored text is really all our key resource into the thoughts of the Sepoys. It's the best resource that we still have. And this resource can be contrasted to kind of like the silencing of Sepoy voices in general in British literature, because literature is very important in the British cultural memory of World War One. Cultural memory being defined by Jan Assmann as a sort of like collective knowledge within which members of a society understand their experience of belonging within the society, and mostly reiterated through generations through reference to cultural formations such as texts. And texts are very important in British cultural understanding of World War One, as Paul Fussell argued in The Great War and Modern Memory, where the writings of people like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon and so on, they created this enduring legacy and enduring imagination of World War One as a moment of as a senseless waste of life, as a futile exercise within the British imagination. And it would be really interesting to be able to place how Sepoys really felt about the war in that context, right? Because if people like Sassoon and Owen, who were white upper middle class Englishmen, young and fairly privileged within the imperial hierarchy, if they felt so alienated, if they felt so bad about this war that they were fighting, then one can only imagine the degree of alienation and trauma being faced by someone who was essentially a young, potentially young Sikh farmer from the Punjab, for example. However, despite how interesting this would be, we have very little recourse to actually finding the Sepoy testimony. So, but despite the absence of literature being written by the colonial soldier for various reasons, there is a great deal of literature about the colonial soldier. Like the Indian soldier was a very attractive subject for British authors at the time, and this literature was, in the words of Rantanu Das of King's College London, it acted as a form of imperial empty biotic, if you will, written to kind of assuage the British public about concerns and anxieties about the empire and the role of Indians within it. And a common device that they used, these British authors, was writing from the perspective of the Indian soldier in a form of mimicry or ventriloquism, as one could call it. And this kind of like illusion of the subaltern soldier's speech kind of help them reproduce imperial discourse. So one of the examples, and I think one of the most fascinating examples of this in action, is the book called The Eyes of Asia by Rudyard Kipling, written in 1917 and published in 1918. And Rudyard Kipling was commissioned by the British intelligence department to create a sort of like commissioned work of propaganda to kind of get neutrals at home to buy into the war better. And he was given access to the censor reports. He was given access to the Indian soldiers' letters to act as inspiration and raw material for his work. So, and he wrote essentially 4 short stories where he kind of, and from the perspective of these Indian soldiers. And it's a very fascinating piece of work because he kind of lifts verbatim various sections from Sepoy letters. He represents quite a lot of things quite faithfully, such as how impressed a lot of the Sepoys were when they arrived in Europe. Like they were generally fascinated. They thought it was some sort of wonderland. They were so green because a lot of them were coming from the Punjab, fairly arid region, and so on. How beautiful it was, and the ingenuity of French farmers, how fertile France was, the equality of women, and so forth. All of these things, like he really latched onto these examples of like them appreciating material culture and farming practices and so on. And he understood these as the soldiers acknowledging the superiority of the white man and the rightfulness of the imperial hierarchy. So his fictional Indian soldiers kind of say things like, "Oh, we in India are stones beside these people," and so on. So like the actual complexity of like what the soldiers are talking about, of like finding all these things impressive and thinking about taking it back home or writing back home and wanting them replicated, he kind of cuts through all that and just has them like as it's very abject form of self-debasement in his work. And he kind of like shows how how so more or less debased these Indian soldiers are by using like all sorts of mawkish tropes of like in their words, like they write in like these florid, overwrought styles, very archaic. They frequently like misunderstand or misspell English. Like they think earls and barons are caste ranks and so on. And like even at the time this would be excessive, but like in addition to that, he also like, reproduces these martial race tropes that I alluded to earlier, such as having Hindu soldiers being incredibly punctilious about their caste, and Sikh soldiers being like violently avenging the death of a young French child, things like that, like showing them to be the defenders of white women, gallant defenders, all that. And so in his version, like these Indian soldiers are good, loyal soldiers who are like given over to violence, but this violence can be usefully controlled and directed by colonial supervision. And colonial supervision, like the presence of the British, is important within the British Empire to make sure that these like violent childlike soldiers didn't cause any harm to themselves or the other non-martial races of India. And at the same time, like aside from like these sort of like tacit um, the sort of like tacit support of the imperial project, they also in the eyes of Asia, like his loyalists, like the soldiers that he writes, they kind of preach messages that run counter to the actual content of Sepoy letters. So like where Sepoy letters are often talking about saying things like, "Oh, for God's sakes, don't come here, don't enlist, don't let my brother come here," and all that. His soldiers are always talking about, "Yes, mother, you should encourage more people to come. We need more people to be here. Like all those like wastrels and idlers in India, they should come here and like be sieves for our machine guns so that like the real men can fight and all that." So that's like, completely contrary to the spirit of the letters themselves. And the letters, they often like go into they often like show actual forms of trauma and anxiety and like actual upset. Like there are frequent references to like dead bodies and death and destruction and like apocalyptic tones and all that. Like clearly these soldiers were going through a lot of the same sort of traumas and processes that are evident within the trench literature of the British trench literature of Saxon and Owen. But in Kipling's versions, like none of that is really there. He excises all forms of like actual trauma out. So like he completely fails to like really identify with them as soldiers. Like all the tropes of like them being Indians, like all the Orientalism and all the ideas of martial races, like loyal, stupid, violent soldiers. It kind of blinds him, or perhaps willingly he was blinded to it. The need to write propaganda kind of blinded him to the fact that within this body of a Sepoy testimony, there's more than enough to show that they had as much vulnerabilities and emotional depth as a British soldier, but in his version, none of that is there. So essentially, like by reproducing the discourse of the master, Kipling's ventriloquized Indian soldiers kind of display the logic of imperial control. And even when little bits, like when there's like actual vulnerability that's shown, such as there's some of the things that Kipling actually managed to like accurately show were passages where these soldiers, like they admire little children, and they talk about their own children, how they miss them and how they miss their mothers, and then they kind of like create like surrogate mother son relationships with like elderly French women whose farms they were billeted at and whose own sons were missing. Like very touching moments like that. All of that is actually there in Kipling's thing, in Kipling's book. And like Shantanu Das argues that these things are there because Kipling himself was separated from his own mother as a child, and that he had lost his own son during World War I as well. So like these things like inadvertently struck a chord with Kipling. But like these moments of empathy, they kind of like, we have to understand that they were not consensually done, right? Like Kipling used these Sepoy letters for his own ends. He wasn't given permission by the Sepoys to look through them. They had no idea he was doing any of this, right? So he was in a position where he could have a one-sided moment where he kind of like could use their words, disregard or use however he wanted to fit his own narratives. And even like when he inadvertently managed to like explore his own personal demons and all that, willingly or otherwise, this was not done in the context of, it was not a dialogue in any respect, right? It shows the silencing of the subaltern voice in not just in the service of imperial control, but also in the sort of like service of the imperialist's own mental well-being and own self-projection. And that's something that I want to kind of look deeper into with some of the other material that I want to work with, which I won't be covering now, such as Rory Grimshaw's novella, The Experience of Ram Singh, The Father of Hers, where it kind of uses this kind of this fictional character, Ram Singh, as a kind of mouthpiece for his own war experiences, like kind of having exploring those same ideas and same incidents through this fictional Indian. And I kind of want to see what happens when there's such a self-conscious and intentional active projection, unlike Kipling's, which is somewhat inadvertent potentially. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. I think I've kind of gone over time anyway. I hope it's been all right and that you've had some interesting ideas. And I would be very happy if you had feedback for me, and which would help me, new avenues that I should be exploring in my research. Thank you.